Good afternoon, and as the case may be in a few cases this morning, good morning also. In a few hours, we in Israel will celebrate Lag BaOmer, albeit this year without many of the public bonfires that we are used to. The holiday itself, over the generations, has been connected for all sorts of reasons, and we won't go into that, with the Bar Kokhba uprising, the last attempt by Jews in the land of Israel in the year 132 CE to restore Jewish independence to the land. It failed, but more than that, this was a major watershed in Jewish history, because in fact, it was the last attempt by Jews in the land of Israel to restore or assume again any semblance of political independence. And this would not recur until the 20th century, till the emergence of Zionism and ultimately the founding of the State of Israel. But more than just the events of the Bar Kokhba War, what I'm interested in today in approaching Tractate Avot, or beginning with Tractate Avot, is who supported this war. And in particular, did the sages, did the rabbis of the period actually embrace Bar Kokhba? Were they political activists who claimed that this extreme step has to be taken if we wish indeed to assume independence? Or possibly did the rabbis oppose this uprising and considered it a folly, an impossible achievement in the face of the all-powerful Roman Empire? And so today, my issue is really what rabbis thought about government, how they related to the government of their day, which primarily in the land of Israel was the Roman Empire, that changed from the Roman pagan empire, evolved into the Roman Christian Empire. And to the east, on the other side of the Euphrates, we will encounter sages who have a different government that they have to relate to one way or another, the Parthian kingdom and then the Persian Sasanian kingdom, which was the kingdom that ruled during the period of the Talmud. And the question is, what behavior, what did the rabbis consider to be the requisite behavior, political behavior, on the part of Jews? Should they oppose foreign rule in the land of Israel, or possibly embrace it as being a critical contribution to the maintenance of law and order in the land? And I suggest that we go to three different Mishnayot in Tractate Avot at the beginning of our talk, and we'll find right off the bat that there's no one opinion in rabbinic literature. And I think if I had to make one point in all of my talk today, it would be that we should stop talking about the rabbinic view of something. The rabbis were independent thinkers. They had different approaches. They had different thoughts about a myriad of issues that were relevant at the time. And what I would like to show is why maybe certain rabbis had one opinion, other rabbis had others. Rabbis in one land might have thought one way, and rabbis in another land another. And so let's go to the very first Mishnah in Tractate Avot, chapter 3, Mishnah 2. This is source number 1. Maria, can we go to source number 1? I hope you can see it. There we are. Rabbi Chanina Sagan HaKohanim says, pray for the welfare of the government, for without fear of her, one would swallow up another alive. Now, if we read this statement, this is not a theological statement at first glance, and I think at all. It's really more of a political, social statement, saying very simply that the existence of government prevents anarchy, prevents chaos. You need some strong preserver of order, of law and order in any society. And so pray for the welfare of that government, whatever government that might happen to be, and wherever you might be situated. it actually conjures up a letter that was written hundreds of years before Hanina, I'll get back to him in a minute, by the prophet Jeremiah at the very beginning of the 6th century BCE. The prophet Jeremiah, just a few years before the destruction of the first temple, Jeremiah writes a letter to the Israelites who had been exiled to Babylonia. And in that letter, which is the continuation of source number 1 that we were looking at, Jeremiah says, "Seek ye the welfare of the city, whither I have carried you away captive. Pray unto the Lord for it, for in the peace thereof ye shall have peace." In other words, wherever you are, pray for the welfare of that government or for that city where you reside at any given time. By the way, this statement in Jeremiah's letter really becomes the source for a prayer that I think we're all familiar with to this very day, a prayer for the welfare of the government. In Israel, it's obviously for the state of Israel, but if you go abroad, and this is a prayer that has existed now for many, many years, different countries have their own text, but it is the prayer for the government. In other words, it is critical that there is some preserver of law and order within any society. Now, this may not be a very, what should I say, optimistic view of society, that without the fear of government, one would swallow up another alive. That may not be a very pleasant thought, but it's a social thought that definitely has certain meaning. So we have a positive statement by Hanina. What is interesting is Hanina lived at the very end of the Second Temple period, and he probably knew already of the stirrings of an uprising that would ultimately bring about the destruction of Jerusalem. And I can't help but wonder whether he did not make his statement, pray for the welfare of the government, in something of an opposition to the zealots of his day, who of course had set out on a totally different path and that would ultimately bring about the destruction of the Second Temple and of the city of Jerusalem. In any case, we have one opinion. But now if we go to the second source right before us, right after that first source number 2, we find a totally different approach. Shemaiah said, "Love labor, hate authority," and by authority he means authority over others. Don't seek to have authority over others, and seek not the intimacy of the ruling powers. In other words, there is some sort of a warning here. Yes, the ruling powers have a very important role to play, but you're not part of it, right? Keep away. It might be dangerous. And source number 3, right after this, again from Mishnah Avot, be careful with the government. For they befriend the person only with their own needs. They appear to be friendly when it is beneficial to them, but they do not stand by a person at the time of his distress. In other words, you can't trust government, right? Beware. But even the positive statement about government, as I said, was not a theological religious statement per se. However, the rabbis some rabbis embrace a different approach as to why one must respect the government. And that's source number 4 in front of us. Moses showed respect for royalty, for so the Holy One, blessed be he, told him, show respect for royalty. And now comes a long list of other well-known persons of ancient Jewish history. And so we find that Joseph likewise showed respect for royalty in his talking to Pharaoh. We find that our father Jacob showed respect to royalty. Now, this is interesting. As it says, and Israel strengthened and sat upon the bed. If you remember, Joseph comes to visit Jacob as he is on his deathbed, and Jacob, probably with great difficulty, sits up. And the source here says he doesn't sit up out of love for his son Joseph, but rather he sits up because you have to respect royalty. And the same is true with Elijah, we are told, who showed respect and ran before Ahab. This is already a theological approach. This is an approach that says royalty or rule has some sort of divine ordination behind it, some sort of divine backing. One would not become a ruler were God not interested in that person in fact, filling that role. And we hear that in a number of sources. Now, this is, I say, is a totally different approach because it claims that God might or should be or would be on the side of the ruling powers, hence you have to respect them, even when those ruling powers might be deemed the evil government or the evil kingdom, etc. And source number 5 gives a good, I think, a good example of that. If we can just move up a bit, there we are. Our rabbis taught. Now this is a story that takes us back to the Bar Kokhba War. And towards the end of the war, we hear of religious persecution, and the rabbis were forbidden, among other things, to teach Torah in public. And our rabbis taught when Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma was ill, Hanina ben Tradion went to visit him, and he says to him, and this is the critical line, Brother Hanina, don't you know that it is heaven, meaning God, that has ordained this Roman nation to reign? For though she laid waste to his house, burnt his temple, slew his pious ones, caused his best ones to perish, still she is firmly established. In other words, God must be on her side. So here again, we have this idea that powers don't just rule haphazardly, they receive some sort of divine support. And as a result, or as we see here, they're ordained by God. What is interesting is Hanina ben Tradion's response, or before he is warned by Yossi, give in. I have heard about you that you sit and occupy yourself with Torah, publicly gathering assemblies, and you keep a scroll of the law in thy bosom. In other words, you've got to recognize the limits of strength here, of power. They're just too powerful. God is on their side, and yet I hear you publicly, right, behaving in opposition to the Roman decrees. The response is interesting. He replies, heaven will show mercy. God will have mercy. To which we encounter a response that I think we could not have imagined that we would see, because his friend tells him, right? Let's go a little further, scroll down a bit. Let me scroll down the source. There we are. He replied, heaven will show mercy, to which his friend counters, I'm talking sense to you and you say heaven will show mercy. It will surprise me if they don't burn you and the scroll of law with fire. In other words, I don't want to hear that God will have mercy. I'm talking sense. I'm talking common sense to you. So you have two rabbis here with radically different approaches on how to react to the Roman persecution. One is to give in, and one is to oppose Rome at all costs. Now, all of this is theoretical, but it had a practical implication as well. In other words, whether one gives in, whether one not necessarily recognizes the legitimacy of Rome, but recognizes that they are a power, they are the ruling power. If you recognize that, there are all sorts of practical implications that ensue. The obvious one being, again, whatever your opinion is, do you recognize the impositions, the taxes that the government places upon you, the restrictions that the government places upon you? Do I have to recognize government rule on a day-to-day basis, not in a sort of theoretical manner? And here, source number 6, together with source number 7, tells us something very interesting. Source number is a Mishnah, and it deals with the question of if the taxpayer, or the tax collector, as well as all sorts of other brigands, but here we're interested in the tax collector. If the tax collector comes to your door and demands payment, obviously for taxes, you are permitted to lie through your teeth. And you can say this, whatever it is, whatever produce you want to take from me doesn't belong to me. It belongs to royalty. The equivalent of I've already paid at the office. In other words, you're allowed to say anything to a tax collector. You are permitted to vow, to take a false oath, which is usually considered a terrible transgression in Jewish rabbinic law of Torah already, right? And here the Mishnah says you can vow to the tax collector and lie, right? look at the last line here. While it says, ye shall not swear by my name falsely, ye may swear to murderers, robbers, and tax collectors. So you're allowed to lie to the agent of the government who comes to collect taxes. Now, this is a Mishnah that was formulated in the land of Israel. We can assume already somewhere, the Mishnah being redacted somewhere in the 3rd century. The Mishnah makes its way to the east, across the Euphrates River to Babylonia, and look at source number 7. They hear this, that you're allowed to lie to the agent of the government, and they're aghast. But did not Shmuel say the law of the kingdom is law? In Hebrew, in Aramaic, dina de malchuta dina. How can you say that you're permitted to lie to the government? We have a famous principle in the name of Samuel that the law of the kingdom is law. And the Babylonian Talmud, as I say, was aghast, and it had to explain the Mishnah. Well, the Mishnah deals with extenuating circumstances. It was a tax collector who went beyond what he was appointed to do. He went beyond the legal due, or he was an unauthorized collector. And so here we see something very, very interesting. That in the two main centers, the two main rabbinic centers, we encounter two radically different approaches as to how one should relate to the government. In the land of Israel, they still apparently embrace, or at least some of the rabbis of the Mishnah still embrace the idea that Rome is an illegitimate presence in the land of Israel. They have no business being here, hence you can lie to them. Whereas in Babylonia, Babylonian government rules that land. It is their land, and the rabbis don't come out against it. And so certainly the law of the kingdom is law. If we go down to number 8, and I'll just give you the gist of the next source to give you an idea of how the rabbis of the land of Israel may have thought. The question comes up. You all know that there is it is forbidden to wear a garment in which wool and linen are mixed. It's called kil'ayim, and you may not put it on your body, as it were, to wear it. Whereupon the Talmud asks, what happens if I am wearing 10 layers of clothing, and on top of those 10 layers, I put on a forbidden garment? Is that also prohibited? And of course, the Talmud very simply asks, why would anybody wear 10 layers of clothing? I mean, that's crazy. And the answer is, of course, to smuggle through customs, right? Nothing has changed, right? And so we have, in other words, and sure enough, who is the person who makes that statement? Rabbi Shimon said in the name of Rabbi Akiva, it is permitted to elude the payment of customs. In other words, you can smuggle through customs because the customs agent is an agent of an illegal presence in the land. And so suddenly we realize that there are different approaches here. Now, even in the land of Israel, whereas Rabbi Akiva's statement seems to be clear-cut, I don't recognize Roman presence. If you go forward 2 generations, towards the end of the 2nd, the beginning of the 3rd century, and to the days of Judah the Patriarch, Yehuda Nasi, he already seems to take a different approach. If we go to source number 9, it becomes very apparent. 4 things were commanded by our holy master, right? Judah the Patriarch, and one of them is, right, do not seek to evade toll tax, the meches, lest they discover you, deprive you of all that you possess. And we have another version of that halakha, that anyone who does cheat the meches, who cheats customs, is like one who sheds blood, is comparable to an idolater, an adulterer, one who violates Sabbath. In other words, chas v'shalom, this may not be done. And so already, maybe the change now is not only between the land of Israel and Babylonia, but between rabbis who lived prior to or during the Bar Kokhba War, like Rabbi Akiva, who refused to recognize Rome, and then to rabbis who lived a few generations later. And the Bar Kokhba War, of course, was a debacle. And the rabbis take it upon themselves to institute and regulate different behavior vis-a-vis the government. And there seems to be some sort of a rapprochement and an acceptance of the fact Rome is here to stay. We've got to come to some sort of a modus vivendi. And so we begin to hear different statements and different views about the government, even from the land of Israel. But I'd like to go back to the Bar Kokhba War for a few minutes, because here, again, if we look at the different sources that describe even the rabbinic attitude towards the person himself, Bar Kokhba, who is referred to in Talmud as Bar Koziba, we'll find radically different, approaches, or a different spirit in even talking about Bar Kokhba, in imagining what he might have been. And if we go to source number 10, one of the famous sources about the Bar Kokhba, and much has been written about this source, but if we can just scroll a wee bit down, there we are. When Rabbi Akiva would behold Bar Koziba, he would say, "This is the king, the Messiah." Now, if indeed Rabbi Akiva made that statement, because there are scholars who claim that there's a textual problem in reading this, but let's assume for the moment that he did make that statement. This is a clear-cut support for Bar Kokhba as being a messianic figure, and a messianic figure in the sense of a ruler. Now we know that Bar Kokhba calls himself on his coins and in documents Nasi, and Nasi indeed can mean a son of David. Just in this week's Haftarah, V'David Avdi Nasi Alehem, my servant David is a Nasi over them. And so Bar Kokhba, he is playing with that word Nasi, suggesting some sort of monarchy, which again maybe alludes to a messianic monarchy. Not everyone agreed. And so we have the opposition statement. Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta replied, "Akiva, grass will grow on your cheeks, and the son of David will still not have come." I used to like to tell my students, there's every city in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel today, has a Rabbi Akiva street, right? Has a street named after Rabbi Akiva. I have yet to encounter the first Rehov Yochanan ben Torta throughout Israel. In other words, if we're talking about two personalities with a dispute over Bar Kokhba, clearly Rabbi Akiva may have been the more powerful supporter. Whether indeed flocks of his students followed into the army of Bar Kokhba is a question which I'll allude to within a minute. But that's the Palestinian Talmud, and it's also to be found in Palestinian Midrash, right? That Akiva makes this positive statement about Kokhba. Let's look at the Babylonian Talmud talking about Bar Koziba, source number 11. And suddenly we realize again that the Babylonians may have looked at this whole episode totally differently. Bar Koziba reigned 2.5 years, and he said to the rabbis, "I am the Messiah." They answered, "Of the Messiah, it is written that he smells and judges." This is very interesting. It's based on a scripture in the prophets, "Vehericho ruach chokhmah." The Messiah will have the sense of smell. He will be able to judge people through the sense of smell. And so they tested him. The rabbis tested him to let us see whether he can do so. When they saw that he was unable to judge by scent, they slew him. This is amazing. According to Babylonian Talmud, it wasn't the Romans that slew Bar Kokhba, it is we rabbis that did away with him. And so here again, you have a totally different approach to this episode of Bar Kokhba and the war that takes place in his time. Now, what is interesting is, when you look at the Yerushalmi, Palestinian Talmud Ta'aniyot, right, source number 12, here you have a totally different relationship between Bar Kokhba and the sages and the rabbis. Not only don't they remove themselves from Bar Kokhba or even claim that they ultimately put him to death because of a false messianic claim, but rather they tell us the following. Bar Koziba was there at Beitar. You all know where Beitar is, not too far from Bethlehem. And this was the last outpost of Bar Kokhba. By the way, we have interesting archaeological evidence that shows that a Roman army actually surrounded the area of Beitar. And Bar Kokhba is then at Beitar, and he had 200,000 soldiers with amputated fingers. The story there is that Bar Kokhba would only induct into his army the bravest of the brave, and to prove indeed that you were brave, you had to be willing to either cut a finger or amputate a finger to show that you have no fear of pain of any sort whatsoever. And so 200,000 soldiers had amputated fingers, to which the sages said to him, how long will you continue to mutilate Israel? In other words, must you go through this ridiculous test? He says to them, how else is it possible to test them? I want to make sure that they are brave. They said to him, anyone who cannot uproot a Lebanese cedar while riding on his horse shall not be enlisted in your army. In other words, we want only the strongest of the strong, and so it has to be a horseman who, while riding, can uproot a cedar of the Lebanon. Only those people will be enlisted. And he had 200,000 of these with amputated fingers and 200,000 of these who uprooted a Lebanese cedar. Many years ago, I participated in a conference, and one of my colleagues said, well, this, of course, has to be a legend because we all know that Lebanese cedars do not grow in the land of Israel. I responded immediately, and I said, well, of course, they're not here anymore because all of them were uprooted in the days of Bar Kokhba. But beyond that, how do the rabbis appear in this source? They're collaborating with Bar Kokhba. They're participating in the war effort. They're suggesting to the commander, to Bar Kokhba, it would be best if you inducted soldiers this way and not that way. In other words, there's no distancing from Bar Kokhba in a story like this. Later on, there will be a story that says that there was a clash between Bar Kokhba and one of the rabbis, and that ultimately led to his defeat. But when you read these stories, you have a sense that Bar Kokhba is somehow embraced. He's not turned aside automatically by the rabbis. And I would suggest that, again, this would probably reflect a different attitude towards the Roman Empire, Roman government, among the rabbis, some of the rabbis at least, in the land of Israel, as opposed to the rabbis living in Babylonia. Indeed, in Babylonia, I think we encounter the first explicit stirrings of a political passivity, of a sense that we're not involved in the political activism that might have existed centuries ago, right? We should just play still, be quiet, don't look for trouble. And this takes us to, of course, the famous source, and it's famous because it has contemporary implications to this very day. It appears in Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Kittu, both source number 13, where we are told, this actually, the source for this statement appears in a midrash from Eretz Israel, but the Babylonians used it in a very particular way. And we're told that there were 3 oaths that were given to the people of Israel based on Shir HaShirim, Hishbati etchem benot Yerushalayim. The word Hishbati appears a number of times, and so there were 3 oaths. One, that Israel shall not go up as a wall. The story is that one of the rabbis, Rabbi Zera, wanted to make Aliyah, right? And his mentor, Rav Yehuda, his Rosh Yeshiva, as it were, said, this is forbidden. Anyone who goes up to the land of Israel transgresses a positive commandment. There is no positive commandment, of course, and a source is, and rather a scripture there is quoted out of text. But his Rosh Yeshiva, in fact, the story begins that he had to avoid his mentor, his Rosh Yeshiva, because he knew his mentor was opposed. If I'm permitted a personal note, I always identified with that rabbi, Rabbi Zera, who had to actually sort of keep the news from his mentor. When I was a youngster in the 8th grade and growing up in Brooklyn, and my Rosh Yeshiva, my rabbi at Yeshivat Eitz Chaim, heard that I wanted to move to Israel, I have not forgotten the day when he approached me and he says to me, by the way, he spoke to me in Hebrew, and he said, Shaya, are you sure you want to go to Israel? Efshar lehitkalkel sham, right? Better for a Jew to remain in a positive Jewish environment, which of course was Borough Park at the time. In other words, you have that sense already in the Babylonian Talmud, but look at the next statement. One is that not to come up en masse, on Aliyah en masse to Israel. The second, and this is the critical one, whereby the Holy One, blessed be he, adjured Israel that they shall not rebel against the nations of the world. So now here you have a formula that says it all. You must embrace political passivity, not necessarily pacifism, but passivity. You are not to be part of the political process if it means rising up against the nations. And I'm sure many of you know this, but this oath became the mainstay, became actually the basis, the foundation for the anti-Zionist ideology in certain circles and rabbinic circles, and Hasidic circles, among others, in modern times. One of the most famous examples, of course, is the Satmar, the first Satmar Rebbe, who wrote a whole treatise against Zionism called The Treatise of the Three Oaths. And there he formulates his anti-Zionist approach based on this statement. So what we have here is critically a statement that was embraced at least by the Babylonian Talmud or by portions of the Babylonian rabbinic environment, that we don't rebel against nations. And as I say, this seems to be very, very typical of the atmosphere that comes through in other Babylonian statements as well. So already we see an interesting divide again between the land of Israel and Babylonia. In Israel, there were different approaches. I'm going back in time to the period just after the Bar Kokhba War, source number 14. And here you have an interesting discussion among different rabbis in their appraisal of the Roman Empire. Rabbi Judah Bar Eli, and these, by the way, are all disciples of Rabbi Akiva who survived the Bar Kokhba War and now are sitting together, and Judah ben Gerim is sitting with them. The first rabbi, Rabbi Judah, opened the discussion and said, "How admirable are the deeds of this nation," meaning Rome. They established marketplaces, bridges, bathhouses. In other words, this is an approach that we recognize, by the way, in non-rabbinic and non-Jewish literature as well. That in the period, in the first first centuries of Roman rule through much of the Roman Empire, they established an economic reality, a social reality. They're the great builders. They are the great benefactors to society. They have kept things moving. And yes, there were wars every now and then, but basically they maintained social order, and by introducing marketplaces and bathhouses, etc. One of the other rabbis, Rabbi Yossi, remained silent. Rabbi Shimon, and this of course is Shimon ben Yochai, and I figured I have to bring him into the discussion today because tomorrow is Lag BaOmer, and how could we not mention him, although we have another story about Shimon that's not too comfortable. Nevertheless, Rabbi Shimon said, right, everything they established, they did only for their own needs. They built marketplaces to quarter harlots therein, bathhouses to beautify their own bodies, bridges to collect tolls. And we already saw how Israeli rabbis relate to the collection of tolls. But sure enough, Judah ben Gerim went, repeated their words, and those words reached the government. And of course, we know that Shimon ben Yochai and his son had to go into hiding. What is fascinating is that the same Shimon ben Yochai, right, who in some sources takes a definite anti-Roman position, embraces an anti-Roman position. There's a strange story, number 15 in these sources here, about his son, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. And here I'll make a long story short. He encounters an officer of the Roman government who's arresting thieves. He tells this Roman official, how can you detect, how do you know who's a thief and who's not a thief? Maybe you take the innocent and allow the guilty to escape. The officer replied, what can I do? It's the king's command. Whereupon Elazar gives him signs. I'll tell you how you can identify who is a real thief and who just gives that impression. And he gives him all sorts of signs. These signs were so impressive that they sent for Rabbi Elazar and appointed him to arrest thieves. Now, this is unbelievable. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Shimon ben Yochai, right? One of the, if we want, extremists in the anti-Roman position, becomes himself an official serving the Roman Empire and arresting thieves. And of course, the rabbis could not accept this crossover to the other side. And thereupon Rabbi Joshua, son of Korcha, sent to him, and he calls him vinegar, son of wine, right? How long will you deliver up the people of our God for slaughter? And the son tries to justify himself. He tries to justify this collaboration. I weed thorns from the vineyard. I'm doing a good service by catching these thieves. Whereupon Rabbi Joshua responds, let the owner of the vineyard, meaning God, of course, come and weed out the thorns himself. And the story continues. He accuses somebody else, or he arrests somebody else. And clearly, there's a problem here in the source. Do we collaborate with the Roman government or not? Or do we simply remove ourselves from any behavior? Now, in understanding the rabbinic attitude towards political activism, towards being involved in politics, we have to understand how rabbis thought about the historical political process. What moves things in this world? How will politics be played out? And do we really have any role other than an auxiliary role, but do we really take a major role in how the history of the world evolves, how the history of nations evolve? And of course, this is a major question for anyone who's even thinking about becoming a political activist. Can I change things? And there are two sources here that I think are critical for understanding the rabbinic mindset. First is source number 16, and then we'll get to source number 17, whom I can tell you candidly is one of my favorite sources in all of rabbinic literature. Not that I don't like 16 as well, Babylonian Talmud, Yoma 10a. You have a number of rabbis sitting around, Rabbah bar bar Chana, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, on the authority of Rabbi Yehuda ben Eli, said. Now, what is the question here? The rabbis see before them two world powers in the Near East, of course. The Roman Empire in the West, the Persian Empire to the East, and these are the arch enemies. And the question is, who will be ultimately victorious, right? How do we know who will be ultimately victorious? Now look at the logic here in this discussion. And so one rabbi says, Rome is destined to fall to Persia. Kal vachomer, aminori, it makes sense. Why? If in the case of the first temple, built by the Semites, meaning the Israelites, and the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, but who fell to the Persians, so the Persians are good guys. And not only that, the second temple was built by the Persians, so that's already 2 points in their favor, and destroyed by the Romans. So that's a demerit for the Romans. Is it not fitting that the Romans fall to the Persians? In other words, of course the Persians are going to be victorious because they have all the good deeds on their side, and Rome has the ultimate dastardly deed, the destruction of Jerusalem, on the other side. And so clearly this empire will be victorious. Whereupon Rav says, Persia, just the opposite. Persia is destined to fall to Rome. His disciples ask him, the builders, meaning of the temple, will fall in the hands of the destroyers? Yes, he replied, this is the decree of the king. God wants it to be that way. Others say that he replied, the Persians also destroy synagogues. Bottom line of a story like this is what? Who's going to be victorious? Whoever is better for the Jews. In other words, politics works its way out through, is it good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? It has nothing to do with your political activism. In other words, neither the Romans nor the Persians need your support against the enemy, because in the end, the victorious side will be the side who deserve to be victorious, not because they have a stronger army or a stronger economy, or better military intelligence, but because they behaved properly towards the Jewish people. So here already, you see that the whole rabbinic imagery of how politics works its way out is different. But I want to get to the last source, the longest one here, source number 17, because here I think we can really get into the debate. And I think it was a live debate among the rabbis of their day, as to whether we should be involved in politics. Should we embrace political activism? The source begins with the dream, with Jacob's dream. And I'm sure you all remember, he's running away from Esau, from his brother Esav, and he reaches a place of rest. He dreams. He sees a ladder set up on the earth. Its top reaches the heavens, and the angels of God are ascending and descending on the ladder. And one of the rabbis, Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachman, says, do you think these were really angels of God? Malachei Elohim yordim are not angels. By the way, the reason they can't be angels, angels as we imagine them with wings and so on, because we all know that angels live up in the heavens. And so if they were the real angels, it would say that the angels were descending first. They have to come down first, and then they would go back up. But here the angels are going up at first and then coming down. And so what the Midrash says is that, he showed Jacob on the ladder the princes of the nations of the world, meaning the representatives of the different nations. He showed him the prince of Babylonia ascending 70 rungs, and Media, which was Persia in rabbinic parlance, ascending 72 rungs. In other words, every nation ascends the number of rungs that the rabbis believed is equivalent to the number of years that they ruled as a kingdom. So Babylonia, 70 years, Media, 72, the prince of Greece, 180 rungs, and the prince of Edom. Now, Edom, of course, is Rome, ascending and ascending without Jacob knowing how many. And Jacob says, God. And of course, remember, this is Rome, and Jacob sees Rome on the ladder, but doesn't see him coming down as the others did. And so Jacob says, will he not descend? And God says to him, Jacob, even if you see him ascend to the heavens, from there I will bring him down, as it is written, though thou make thy nest as high as an eagle. I like that, it's a Roman eagle. And you set yourself among the stars, I shall bring you down. But now comes the important part of this midrash. And I think that here we have before us a major debate. And I'm dying to know who wrote this midrash and who it represents. Rabbi Brechia, Rabbi Chelbo, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Melasseh, on the authority of Rabbi Meir. It's a whole list of people. Maybe no one wants to take responsibility, but in the end, it appears in the name of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir, let us remember, is one of the older disciples of Akiva, who apparently also lived through the Bar Kokhba War. He showed him the prince of Babylonia ascending and descending, not just going up, but coming down as well. And the prince of Media ascending and descending. And the prince of Greece ascending and descending. And the prince of Edom also ascending and descending. In other words, what did he show him? He showed Jacob how history works its way out. This is history, right? Nations go up, what goes up must come down, and this is the path of history, and every nation has its ascendancy, and then it descends. And now Jacob says, and this is the critical line, he, Jacob, said to him, just as these have descended, I too will descend. In other words, Jacob asks himself, should I get on this ladder? Am I part of the process? Because if I get up on the ladder, you just showed me that what goes up comes down. And so Jacob, and of course, remember something, Jacob has another name, Israel, right? The dilemma isn't just the single person Jacob, it's Israel. And he's asking himself, should I be part of this process? Do I have to get on the ladder like all the other nations? And God tells him, fear not, go up, for you will ascend, but not descend. In other words, God says, you have to be part of the process. You can't stand aside, passive, right, aloof, as it were. You shall be on the ladder, but you will be different, right? It's sort of a religious Zionism of sorts. In other words, you have to get on the ladder, but I will be, right, your support. You will not descend. And now comes the next statement. Nevertheless, he, meaning Jacob, feared and did not ascend. This is a tremendous indictment on the part of the Midrash. In other words, and I'm dying to know who's making this indictment. Somebody is not happy somewhere in the rabbinic period with the fact that Israel has abandoned the political ladder, right? And interpreted this as not having trust in God, right? And considers this to be a sin. And remember something, Jacob doesn't just have a dream. He's running away. He's running away from history. He cannot stand up to his brother Esau. He's afraid to respond to a threat. By the way, he's also running away from the land of Israel, right? So he's really abandoning. There's a famous midrash that says that the angels that went up on the ladder were the angels of Eretz Israel because they have no permission to leave the land, and the angels coming down were the angels of Chutz La'aretz, right, outside of the land, and they will accompany Jacob on the continuation of his trip. But the question is, has he not sinned? Rabbi Brechia, Rabbi Chelba, Rabbi Shimon ben Nasya said, Rabbi Meir used to expound this verse. For all this they have sinned, believe not in his wondrous work. This applies to Jacob, who did not have faith and did not ascend. In other words, according to Rabbi Meir, right, this was the ultimate sin. He did not trust in God's promise that if you get on the letter, I will be your support, right? And I will be your defender, right? But now he did not have faith, and God said to him, if you had believed and ascended, you would never have descended. But now that you did not have faith, did not ascend, your children are destined to be enslaved by the nations and caught up by the kingdoms, from kingdom to kingdom, from Babylonia to Media, from Media to Greece, from Greece to Edom. And Edom, of course, is now Rome. He says, Jacob says, master of the universe forever, and God then, right, comforts him, fear not my servant Jacob, I will save you from afar. But this midrash, I think, expresses the dilemma confronting the rabbis. Are they part of the political system? Should they be part of the political system? And at least the author of Midrash was not happy from his sense of an abandonment of politics. I can tell you, privately, I'd love to read this Midrash on Yom HaAtzmaut, so all sorts of people who would embrace the more pacifist approach, because here the approach seems to be, you have to do what all the other nations are doing. You'll need an army and you'll need territory, you'll need whatever it is that you'll need, right? But I'll be on your side. And so I'm dying to know who the Midrash reflects. And more than that, is this a reaction to the post-Bar Kokhba passivity that seems to have embraced not just the rabbis of Babylonia, but in many ways the rabbis of the land of Israel as well, and including even Judah the patriarch. So here we sense that there is not one opinion here, that there's a clash of ideas within the rabbinic movement. And I would venture again to repeat what I said at the very beginning of my talk, that we should stop thinking in terms of the rabbinic idea about, right? Rabbis had many ideas, they clashed, they had different opinions, they were independent thinkers, and they were very sophisticated independent thinkers who had their own, many of them embracing their own world views. We have some time here, and I thought that in the last 10 or so minutes, I might be able to answer, or at least hear, some of the questions that were raised. So if Ariel can read off some of the questions from the chat, I'll be very happy to try to answer. Yes.
So we have two questions, and this is your kind of opportunity to write. If you have any more questions, this is your time to do so. Dvora Renner asked if you would mention Dina de Malchuta Dina. I think you mentioned that earlier.
Excellent.
If maybe you would like to add.
First of all, this has been misinterpreted. There are a number of major works written on this whole issue of Dina de Malchuta Dina. One of them by the late Professor Shmuel Shiloh of the Hebrew University, who was also a very good friend of mine, and another by a student of mine who wrote a book on the Exil Arcade in Babylonia, Jeffrey Herman. Dina de Malchuta Dina is not a sweeping statement that everything that the government declares must be respected. It deals in the Babylonian Talmud with two issues: the payment of taxes and the transfer of land, the purchase of land, the selling of land. And the reason is simple. The Babylonian king, they own the land. It's their land, right? And so you have to respect that legal basis for accepting the laws of the land. This is not a sweeping statement, And it is definitely not a sweeping statement relevant to the land of Israel. They don't use it in the land of Israel. People love to quote it. Again, I hope you all realize that I was trying to be as irrelevant and non-contemporary as possible in my talk. People love to quote this statement. In current realities, it's not relevant. And so, yes, there is this phrase, Dina de Malchuta. By the way, the question is, was it Shmuel, Samuel, who first formulated it, or one of the exilarchs? But yes, it does say something, not so much about how Jews ought to behave, but rather how Jews relate to the powers that be. And it's a direct continuation, really, of Jeremiah's letter to the exiles in Babylonia. Pray for the well-being of that city in which you reside. Yes, any other question?
One more question we have from Alan Levine. He's asking, how about Jesus, render unto Rome, which is Rome's, and God, that is God's?
Again, if this takes us back to the Second Temple period, we know that the opinions, in other words, I think Christianity really embraced some of the same ideas that we can find within certain groups of Judaism, that is to say, recognize Rome as being the practical ruler of the land, but that doesn't mean that that has to take the place of your proper religious behavior towards God. In other words, you can come to some sort of a modus vivendi between how you serve God and how you serve Rome. Among the Jewish population of the late Second Temple period, we find totally different approaches. Josephus Flavius, the great historian, tells us that at least beginning in the Galilee, there was a group that he refers to as Sicarii, who claimed, not only need you not recognize Rome, but Josephus says that according to the Sicarii, who ultimately become among the fighters, some of the fighters in Jerusalem as well, and the people at Masada as well, according to the Sicarii, if you recognize Roman, the legitimacy of Rome, you are basically an idolater, because Rome considers itself to be something of a deity, right? Anyone who looks at the Roman emperor as being the all-powerful king of the world in any way whatsoever basically denies God's power. Now, there's a certain degree of truth to this. Anybody who lived in the land of Israel in the first century and saw a Roman coin, he saw the words Divus Augustus. Roman emperors became gods upon their death. If the Romans liked them, Augustus was proclaimed a deity, and the coins say it, Divus Augustus. This is a great story, by the way, of one of the emperors, Vespasian, on his deathbed, and he's surrounded by his cronies, and he looks up at them and he says, "Gentlemen, I fear I'm about to become a god." Right? And one sense is he would have been a lot happier remaining emperor for a few more years than embracing the deity. But clearly, there were people who considered any recognition of Rome to be tantamount to idolatry. And as a result, Josephus says, these Sicarii were even willing to take their own lives and the lives of their family, because, you know, it's sort of what later on rabbis would call yehareg ve'al yehavor, let a person accept death rather than transgress the law of idolatry. And so here, that would have been a critical issue among certain Jews in the land of Israel. But then there were people who said just the opposite, right? We began with a statement by Hanina Sagana Kohanim, who has a whole statement about Gadol HaShalom, about how wonderful peace is, right? And so again, this is a very variegated population. It's a very variegated society. And we have to realize that those differences find their way into the rabbinic movement as well. Any other question?
Great. Deborah Renner is also asking if you would say something about Mesira.
About?
Mesira. Mesira, Din Mesira.
Moser? I don't know if that's really, if I understand the question, then I don't think it's really that relevant. In other words, in the sense of collaboration. In other words, although I don't know if that, again, we saw one story where one of the rabbis collaborates with the Romans. Yes, that was considered to be treacherous, to be traitorous. In other words, if a person divulges certain secrets to the other, to the enemy, or to Rome, or to whomever it might be, that would be an ultimate sin. I'm not sure that becomes a major issue in what we were discussing today about rabbis and government in general. But of course, if war want to become the ultimate Moser, you know, it had terrible reverberations in just a few decades ago in Israel. But I don't think that was the issue uppermost in the mind of the rabbis. Rabbis had a very serious decision to make. Do we join the ranks of the rebels, or do we stand aside and maybe even try to dissuade people? Because they could have followed the path of Josephus, who makes speeches in his book and claims he's made these speeches to the zealots themselves, trying to convince them that this is meaningless. By the way, it's Josephus himself who also said, God must be on their side because they've been so successful, right? And there's a long speech that he makes, and I'm sure most of the people left in the middle of the speech, right? But he makes this long speech listing all of the nations that the Romans had conquered to prove that God must be on their side. So the rabbis were confronted with that approach, and I think some of them embraced it, right? We saw one of the cases here where others refused to accept that approach, right? Yes?
Okay, so we'll just take our final question. Mel wrote that you didn't mention that there is a view that the third oath, that the Gentiles do not oppress Israel too much, is used and violated to negate Israel's requirement not to rebel against the Gentiles nations.
By the way, that only appears in the Babylonian Talmud. In the parallel source, it is that they don't push forward the end of days too quickly. In other words, they don't look for a messianic era before it's time. The third part of the oath, of course, is there's a balancing act. I'm telling Jews not to rebel, but of course, once you're told, don't raise up arms, right? Don't rebel, then the fear is, well, then they'll annihilate us. And so the third oath is really a continuation of the first two oaths. Yet you don't express any overt political activism. I will make the nations take an oath that they don't distress you so much. I always thought that statement, you know, that they don't oppress Israel too much, reminds me always of the definition of an anti-Semite is somebody who hates Jews more than necessary, or something like that. What is too much, right? It's a very strange statement. I think, though, that we've covered that. And thank you all for being here. I don't know if you know this, but you've celebrated with me my 52nd wedding anniversary, which takes place this evening. So,
first of all, a great, big mazal tov to you.
Thank you.
Very, heartwarming that you're sharing this with us. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for this incredible shiur. It was very enlightening and interesting. So thank you to Professor Isaiah Gafni for being here. And thank you all for being here. Before you kind of leave, we would like to invite you, like Tamar said earlier, to another shiur, interesting, on this Thursday at 5 o'clock with Professor Hillel Furstenberg, also about Pirkei Avot, called Glory and Its Woes. So you are more than welcome to join us there. And before you leave, you can also take a look at our other events, also in English, on Bet Avichai's website. And this shiur will be up there as soon as possible with the resource sheets. So we are all waiting to see you there. So thank you so much and have a great day to all of you.